We are ready.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have the extraordinary Farah Bashir today. Her new novel, her first novel.
It's a
Uh,
non-fiction.
yes. Rumours of Spring, A Girlhood in Kashmir. A wonderful book, which I just spent last night reading. And of course, I have to say that it moved me to a great extent, to a large extent. And it also reminded me of some of the years that I had spent in Kashmir. But of course, a different decade perhaps, and a less troubled one. So, Farah Bashir, welcome to our conversation today. And, you know, this book is obviously a lot of it is your own experience, although it is a novel. And I think I can take that liberty of saying that perhaps it is a lot of it is your own experience. It's so extraordinary for you to remember, the smells, the taste, the sights, to recollect all that. How hard was it? Because this is what, about 20 years now?
More than that.
Yeah. And for you to have remembered all this or to recall all this, it must have been very painful.
Uh, Thank you for reading it. I mean, let me sort of thank you first for that. And now to your question about remembering it accurately, sensorially. So after I've finished writing it, and when it was ready, I just went back into thinking, how did I start writing really? And I remembered that when schools used to be shut most of the time, and we used to get these diaries at school for the whole year, because for homework assignments, etc., and they were empty because schools were shut most of the time. I started journaling from the age of 14. And for some reason, I used to be like, oh, I have to create my own codes. I started nicknaming people so that they're not, the identity doesn't get revealed just in case someone reads it. So I think that became like a practice to remember things very, very minutely and remember the minutest details about things. And that became a habit also when I was studying later. I remember a bunch of us, some of us friends, whenever we used to watch a film together, and I would talk about some details which they probably had missed, and they'd be like, did we watch the same film together? So it became like a habit of remembering the slightest, even the most missable details.
And I think that is what is so extraordinary about the book. I think for anyone who has lived even for a month or two in the valley, all that will just come back to such an extraordinary degree that it's sometimes, you have to take a break in the novel and then go back to it again. And your relationships with, your father, your mother, how things change over time, pre 1990, as you say, and post 1990, as you say. Talk a bit about that, because for most readers, and you mentioned this in the book as well, that you thought that this period was not covered or reported in the media, and then you realized that it was, and that it still didn't make a difference to people. How extraordinary was that to find for someone who lived through that period and then looked back on it and thought, my God, it didn't make a difference to anyone or
Yes,
to very few people.
I grew up thinking naively that, oh, people are not so heartless. It's not that they would know about things and still look away. And, I didn't really realize how fatigue sets in. Hadn't realized how apathy how things become normalized. So I grew up thinking, so I started looking at what were the big events that had happened in 89. So Berlin Wall had happened, Dalai Lama had won the Nobel Prize, Tiananmen Square had happened. So I said, oh, it was too much happening. So the world doesn't really otherwise look away. But then I realized that what really happened, what happened to women especially. I mean, when I finished the book and I looked at all the chapters that I'd written, though I call it a memoir and though it's about a girlhood, but there are actually the only 9 chapters about me as a girl, but there are 14 other women whose stories I tell, and there are like 14 chapters about them. So it was really about how it impacts women on such a basis, which you will never hear in other memos, like political memos. Let's say Bashar P wrote a memo. He wrote about the reportage. He wrote about what was happening on the streets. But how are women coping with it? I used to be petrified. I used to pull my hair out. And I've done that for 28 years of my life till I actually started writing. It was just that every time I used to feel anxiety or even excitement sometimes, I would just like pull out a chunk. So these are the things which are hard to relate. And this is something that you don't really, I mean, no matter how many reports did I read, I was working briefly with Reuters and we used to get news and I read pretty much everything in the archive, but I couldn't really find what happens to women when they are in war and how they become a dual recipients and also sort of their emotions become very secondary. But
Mm.
that what happens around you informs you. I mean, it informs you in a way that it shapes your life and your decisions, and you somehow never are cured or you never come out of it in some ways. So that changed my relationship with my parents, that I also talk about the book, was like any ordinary girls. And she was like, I was bargaining about I need to go and get a haircut from a particular salon, all my friends go there. So finally when that happened, and then that hour everything changed around me. So I started, sort of became I wasn't there was this inability to cry. I only started crying at a much later stage. The tears just wouldn't fall. I mean, even when my grandmother passed away, I think it was much later when I started processing it. So, and I started just becoming extremely scared for the longest, for a few months, few weeks at least. I was like, oh, did I do something? Is this happening because of me? And you have these strange questions as a kid. So it was really like writing about was also about articulating those silences of that 13, 14, 15-year-old girl, which she couldn't ask. Like, for example, if you're hearing about political rapes, how do you articulate a
Right.
question about that? If, for example, when Rubaiya Said was kidnapped, that shook me. That was 89 December. Our schools were about to shut for winter vacation. And the only point of reference in medical school was this neighbor, Lakshmi Shri Kaul. And I was like, I mean, that was the only person she was the only person I could have asked what happened. Did she know her? So all these questions I had.
Because she was also studying medicine
She
at
was
the
studying
time.
medicine, exactly. And then they probably left before 1990. They did not really wait till there because the girl, I mean, it was, as a girl, it was so scary, and so these things about these questions you don't know how to form, and there is so much happening outside on the street. You can't just sit, and it's not like a short period that'll, it'll get over. You will go and talk to your parents or your sister, ask these questions. Things were changing rapidly on an hourly basis. So these were things which literally took me up to a decade to process and really wonder what happened. I mean, the fact that I actually used to seek anyone. I mean, when I was studying and working in Singapore, you see so many South Asians there. You don't go walk up to everyone and talk, but every time I used to see someone with Deja, I used to just like make it a point and go and speak to them because, and then I processed it like it was probably that conversation I didn't have with Lakshmi Shri and which I couldn't have. And it was probably me seeking her out somewhere. So it really took a long time to process my behaviors and decisions that I was sort of making.
Yeah. So there are two things that I wanted to ask you. One, of course, is the impact on the body. How you actually started walking, how you started covering yourself, and you saw other girls as well wearing the hijab, and how you would walk in a public place because you were always so terrified of the eyes. It's the eyes that are always watching you, whether you could see them or not. And how extraordinary sometimes people would open a window just for some fresh air, and there would be a bullet ricocheting off the window pane, and that would be it. There's so many dangers of the public space, whether you're walking in it or whether you're just opening a window for God's sake for fresh air. That's one part of it. And I want you to talk about that. How does it impact the body, especially now that you hear all these vile things about, oh, we will go there and we will marry the Kashmiri girls. It's so vicious and vile. And you wonder, what does it do to the women of Kashmir? And I think this is something that rises above religion. It has nothing to do with religion. That's one. And we'll talk about that as well. But the second thing is as well the whole the the absence of the Kashmiri pandit. you know you capture that so beautifully in that absent present. All the Kashmiri pandits, the teachers, the students, they're just absent. And yet the Sikhs stay. And you mentioned that the Sikh teachers, they stay. The Sikh shopkeepers, the storekeepers, they stay. That's the other part that I want to talk to you about. And I've always wondered, because as a Kashmiri Pandit, I'm also one of those. I personally, of course, didn't live there, but I know families who just left and never went back. But they always thought that they were going back. You
Yep.
know, they never thought that, like you, they never thought it would continue for so long. So those are two things. I know they're very different, but they're also related. But talk first about the impact on the body. And as a young woman, how did you feel? What went through you, through your mind?
It was I all I wanted was to like literally disappear at some
Yeah.
points. Yeah. So I remember there was crackdown in the house, and I could like literally feel my heart beat against my ribs, right? I just wanted to dissolve at that point and just like disappear. And the paramilitary or the security force, whoever, when they walked in, and they didn't do anything actually in that particular room. They would just like go crazy in the rest of the house. That particular day, I remember I was like I was I was like literally hugging my body so that I could like break it, and just
Mm,
like break it once and for all, and just not exist. So that was one aspect of it. Second is when which is not some I mean which is something I cover briefly, but it became quite significant much later, in later part of 90s, which is when counterinsurgents, Ikhwan also sort of came in, and women became like, your bodies just didn't belong to you. The way you dressed, the way you conducted yourself. Women always were like, you have to dress up in a certain way. You can go out at at designated times. You can't go out all the time, especially when, let's say, there was relaxation in curfew hours in the evening. You would hardly see women outside. You'd see men out, you would see them buying stuff, but women would not really go out to get fresh air. So that curfew relaxation didn't mean anything. So for me, it was literally like pulling out of that hair. I just became obsessed with that. I mean, at one point, I had like massive patches. Second was about just it was also like when you're growing up and you think maybe like looking me growing up and me developing as a young into a young girl, into a young woman, it might have implications on what happens to me. So will I be responsible for that as well? So I stopped taking care. I wouldn't like literally like use soap or anything on my face, and I would just like wash it for the heck of washing it. So again, this neglect, turning against your own body,
yeah.
trying to mutilate it in some ways so that you don't become responsible for your own destruction, was something that was very and I later realized, because these are points of humiliation and embarrassment. I mean, you don't tell everyone that I pull out my hair. I mean, this was like much later when I realized what I was doing, is when I started sharing it with people, especially when I would go for a haircut, not in Kashmir, outside. Initially, I would say, "Acha, wo chewing gum lag gaya tha." It happened by accident. I started making these excuses for my own humiliation. But then I realized, no, I mean, it's okay to talk about that. I also happened to read this book called Good Women of China by Shinran, this author, and she talks about how there was this young girl, about 13 or 14 years of age, who was abused by her father or stepfather at home. So she has this wound that she's taken to the hospital. And as the wound starts getting better, and she's abused by this father slash stepfather, as the wound starts getting better, she starts fiddling with it again,
Yeah.
yes, that it doesn't heal and she doesn't have to go back to abuse. I think when the external circumstances become threatening, we just like turn against our bodies and start doing things which are unimaginable. And then that I also I have a really bad back, uh, but it also I realize it, and I it's my lower back usually. But much later, I realized it was actually the upper back, which was strangely there was like a curve because I used to walk like this all
Walk
the time.
to crouch. Yeah. In
Yeah,
fact, there's this very sad line where you talk about your father, how he used to lie back like a king, and then slowly on his favorite
started. Yeah,
cushion, and
yeah.
slowly started crouching. How
Okay.
sad is that? That's a diminishing of an entire
People,
community, you know?
yeah, of people. So this is what I realized with like these small things started making sense to me much later. Like what happened to him just sitting like that and just calling me if there was something that I liked on television, and but then it was like as if it was always ready to get up and go
To
or
move.
be alert. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
So those little things, and like or what we were talking about, this me hugging this bag all the time, so I used to
yeah,
always feel like a file or something then, and it just became like this. And I now have started having trouble with my neck because
yeah.
I just it's like it just comes back. So that is one. Second, the question about Kashmiri Pandits, which I sort of spoke about before also, was this was again like my there was this girl called Renuka Bazaz. I haven't managed to find her anywhere. Maybe she's changed her surname, or she got married or something. She and I used to like literally compete in the class for grades, like first, second. There was this thing about us. And when they left, my I didn't see her in school because that was the longest break, or actually the schools opened after 7 months. They shut in 89 December, and they briefly opened in May 1990. And after the assassination of Maulvi Mohammad Farooq, they were shut again
Yeah.
for about, I think, a good 2 months. So that was also something that I hadn't processed. Like for example, there is also this passage about when my sister used to make her own shampoo,
Yeah.
right? So there was this huge shop, Zindlal's shop, who used to sell all the things, spices, etc. And his shop was literally at the mouths of the bridge. It branches out into Zanakadal Gurgari Mohalla and Pathar Masjid on the left. That was taken over, like there was like a huge bunker there. So, and how does a girl sort of articulate questions and ask like what happened, where are they? So that is one aspect. With reference to Renika, I was so disoriented that my grades started fluctuating
Yeah.
from, yeah, so they just went
But
up and down.
she was your,
It was
in a
like
way,
a
yeah.
I anchored her, she anchored me in a way when it came to studies. So that went away, and I struggled with studies for a long time to sort of get back to even like average grades, to be honest, after eighth standard. Yeah, it was much later only when I started studying literature is when I started getting interested back in studies. Otherwise, I had just like sort of just lost the lost interest really, and I didn't know why. And it was frustrating my parents. Like, पढ़ाई में इतनी अच्छी थी, इसको अचानक क्या हो गया?
Hmm.
So yeah, I mean, these are things again which will take time for you to process, to really figure out what happened.
And I think there's another book out there which needs to be written by you. I think there's, because it stops at a time where it stops, I think, around 1994.
94, that's right.
Yeah. But there's so much else, of course, that happened. But it's also perhaps that's when you left the valley. I'm not too sure.
No, I left home for studies actually much later after 9/11.
Hmm.
I was there and I went. That period is by then we had gotten used to exams not happening, schools not being open, uncertainty essentially. We had gotten used to that. And I'm working on a group portrait of women, which and the time period starts from 95
Hmm.
and goes on for about like a decade. But that when you start understanding what fear is, what beauty is, what love is, and you also want to live life normally, but there are extreme circumstances around you. So then what are the choices you make as young girls? So yes, I am sort of working on that part as well.
Farah, I also wanted to ask you, people now talk about lockdown, they talk about curfew in the rest of India, so to speak. And, Kashmiris have lived with that. They've seen it all. When you look out and you see the rest of the world grappling with, and the world, not just India, the rest of the world grappling with things that were actually part of your lives, what crosses your mind? Is it a sense of bitterness? Because sometimes there can be so much bitterness because the world didn't understand what you were going through, and now when the world is going through that, do you think it understands it more, or it just doesn't care?
See, some behaviors come back.
Mm.
I would say there was also a little bit of comfort that everyone in the house was present.
Yeah.
So there was that. But then home was not safe at all. But in this situation, I think that's the in here, if everyone says be home and be safe,
Be home. Yeah.
that, yeah, being home and being safe was no guarantee.
Right.
There was no way you could, like, there is a chapter where my young cousin, because they lived by the lake, and they used to they Nagin Club was that's where paramilitary used to be stationed, and they used to flash these bright lights at night. And this cousin of mine, she was around 7 or 8. Instead of being scared of dark, she was scared of light
Mm.
as a child. So again, home didn't really mean safety, is what I'm trying to say. Right now, we know home means safe.
But that's quite extraordinary, isn't it? That you can be at home and the slightest you talk about. There's a passage where you're just raising your voice, answering your mother, and your little nephew wakes up with a start,
Yeah,
and you wonder what he's absorbed even while he was in his mother's womb.
yeah,
But that's again, you have an entire generation that's grown up like that.
that's right.
At least you had an experience of the other.
Yeah.
You had an experience of a full community. When you see kids who are younger than you, what do you think?
I see they have no point of reference really of what life was.
That's why your book is so important. Sorry to interject.
Not at all.
I feel that's why your book is so important, because it's so important to tell them that there was this time before, and people did live happily,
Yeah,
and you could raise your eyes, and you could
yeah,
look people in the eye and not always be conscious of your body. You could do all this,
that's right.
right?
We were sort of lucky in a way that there is a point of reference for
Yes.
our generation, and we were probably the only generation.
Yeah.
And they have no point of reference, is what I realized. Like look at my niece who is about 8 now, and they live near Saura, and it's a restive area.
Yeah.
And she has literally grown up on Pava spray and tear gas there. And she feels prickly and she has like respiratory issues, etc. So, for them, it'll also be, I mean, it's like a history book, to be honest, for her to understand how her mother grew up, right? So, we were sort of like lucky in a way to sort of, also for the world, what I've realized, for the world to empathize, you have to see where the point of empathy will come from. If you are relying heavily on media reports, which does a great disservice to us as a people, then you're like, oh, they are anti-national, they are troublemaker, they're
Yeah.
miscreant, and whatever is happening to them is justified.
You're right.
The minute you show that there is an aspect, they had lives, they had names, they had relations, they had families, this is how they lived, and that's what and that all changed, and that all's gone and going. I think somewhere it might just sort of touch someone's heart and say and create that sense of empathy. So I'm not really, that was also one of the points that I didn't want external, and I didn't want external factors to sort of be that point of empathy, like where empathy or the opposite of it would come from. I just wanted to show the juxtaposition, the before and after, and how ordinary lives, like any one of us live, like how they were changed and completely like gone, and you know and lives and behaviors and habits and health and destruction really of a time. uh, it's also about how a way of life that we had then
Yeah.
completely is doesn't exist in Kashmir anymore. And this used to be my, I used to, that was a loss again that I didn't know how to sort of write, but I had to sort of keep it, like I had to write about it. I just felt like, if I tell, I remember my nephew read this, the manuscript, and he's like, why were you so, you're so scared when there was this curfew the first time? So for him, it's so
It's
normal.
normal. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's where I realized that no, it's very important to tell them and make them understand that the reality was very different. Also, like there was like a pre that, and it's possible to have that.
Farah, sometimes, when we talk about suffering, especially with Kashmir, it gets so divided and gets so divisive because it's always, oh, your suffering was nothing compared to my suffering. And it becomes a religious thing, it becomes a communal divide. Then the pundits get up and say, oh, but we left and we were deprived of our homeland. And it happens all the time. It happens, for instance, when Basharat's book came out. It happened when Haider came out. In the most, that was when I heard it in the most virulent way the first time. And I mean, my sense is that suffering is suffering. I mean, you can't measure one person's or one community's suffering compared to another. But you do hear that a lot, don't you? And especially as a young woman, you must be hearing of the young Pandit woman's suffering as well. And how do you measure that? No, I mean, how do you say hers was greater than yours or yours is greater than hers?
I don't
How
think.
sad is that?
Yeah, that is extremely sad. And I've luckily met people, Kashmiri Pandit friends also, who don't think like that. I remember there was this journalist friend, she used to work with PTI and now she's settled in Singapore.
I know she's a cousin from Posh.
No, there's the Namita.
Okay, okay.
She said, initially she was so bitter that she was like, how Posh is like family, and so it was Namita. But Namita was like, she was so bitter when they left initially, and then she was like, I saw that we at least are alive.
Right.
They are not even alive to really get consolidate what they have, or start again. So I understand there's bitterness. And like I said, this, for example, for my niece, for my nephew, their generation, they don't know what a Kashmiri Pandit is. My mother, obviously, she grew up with them, she studied with them. I grew up, I studied with them. My mother has given me this bag of walnuts last year. And I had to give it to her friend on Shivratri, but then lockdown happened last year and it's still here and I couldn't even give it to her. So I also see relations like that.
Yeah.
And I don't really always see bitterness, but then sometimes to push your narrative. And I'm also aware of people who do that overtly. I mean, there's no justification of displacement. I'm not saying that their suffering was less or ours is more, or they are alive or we are not. It's a community that has suffered so like immensely that really we're just weaponizing, or we're being like pawns
Yeah.
by whoever wants to weaponize that pain. But at the end of the day, loss is a loss is a loss.
Yeah.
So I personally feel extremely pained, to be honest.
Yeah.
I do. I
Because you think that, I mean, we've all suffered, haven't we? I mean, and this is the moment actually for reconciliation.
This is also them to think that if this continues and there are still people living in the camps, where are their
Yeah.
voices? What they're still there. It's 30 years. I mean, why should they be there? you
Right.
know so it's not only people who get airtime and are active on social media. uh, what about those people as well? So
It's
yeah.
really it's possibly one of the most brutal and one of the most silent repressions of history, which it needs voices like
Yeah,
yours and
every
many.
quarter. Yeah,
Yeah.
because that's not the way. Otherwise, how long will this repression go on by using, oh, what happened to Kashmiri Pandits? Or how long will they keep suffering by saying that uh, you can't go back and they have driven you out? And there has to be somewhere a point where they both belong to Kashmir.
Yeah.
So, It's
And
come together.
as they did, and they were both proud of the fact that they had a special status, that they had a state, that they had a community which was so distinct, and they took great pride in being in that together. And
Exactly.
people, of course, laugh away that whole idea of syncretism now, but it isn't a joke. I mean, it was a reality, you know.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
it was not something that was constructed. It existed.
exactly. But there's a lot of post facto rationalization that's taking place and saying that, oh, it didn't exist in any case, you know, so what do you want to go back to? But Farah, also tell me, you know, the whole idea of mental illness. Now, that's something that we, again, the world is grappling with. And Kashmir has seen it in spades, you know. And there's so much of that in the book as well. So many people exhibiting signs of it, which I guess you later as an adult must have processed as, for instance, your mother starting to use more water in her curries, you know, from the time when she used to, when your father used to
They
say
used to
that.
bicker about it. Yeah.
I just love that because it has happened so many times in my home as well. You know, that excess oil, you you take it out and
And they just like feel so proud. Yeah.
yeah, of course.
Women.
uh, but but things like that, you know, so your mother doing that, you know, now when you think back, you think, oh, there was obviously, you know, this was her way of maybe just conserving for the future, I don't know. So talk a bit about that whole mental illness which you saw happening in front of you, and how do you process it now?
The the transformations that happened in people were really drastic. People started because you didn't have control any on the streets. You wanted to exert that control at home.
Hmm.
So a lot of, I mean, there was fear, and then people just do strange things out of fear, out of panic.
Hmm.
So behavior started like changing. I saw that, like, if I were to visually sort of talk about it, it was like literally shrinking of families, as if we came together, but we came together in a lot of fear, in a lot of, oh my God, what's going to happen. So fear was a primary driver, really, that sort of change people's behaviors. There's also a chapter about this, my father's cousin,
Yeah.
who was not, who had some issue by birth, or he had fallen, and he just couldn't process when he used to get beaten up, or someone would ask him something. So he started taking it out on his wife, and things like that happened, and people just started getting more irritated. But then also things about how the anxiety, general anxiety, palpitation. Vasvas is something which is basically associated with palpitation. Vasvas was something that my grandmother used to say all the time. Mishu vasvas, Mishu vasvas, that's her. Vasvas was associated with every single thing. Father came home late, she would have that. She would hear about firing. She would get up in the middle of the night. "Ki hine mein go vasvas," like I'm really palpitating. And so that palpitation was really anxiety, sort of getting in everyone's life, which took then really different routes. At a point, I just didn't want to see sunlight. This is late 90s, and I used to be sitting in a dark room, and obviously, like any parent, my parents would take me to a doctor, and Mushtaq Marhoob had about like 2 months waiting till you could actually get an appointment there. And I also studied psychology, and I used to go to the institution there. And more than and I would see like there were cases of split personality or schizophrenia which would change within seconds. This is what our professors would say later. This is like unprecedented what you see here. This is not how people usually behave in these disorders. I used to come back and I used to like just not talk to anyone for 3 days. So that was a seeing it, like when one would do field work, then families behaving very strangely. And that is something that I wanted to capture in this, but one chapter was not really enough, or two chapters weren't enough, because that is something which the families fundamentally changed. They just became something else, from loving families to fearful families to scared families. When I also remember when Rubaya said again, I think that's such a defining moment in my as a child when she was released and she hugged her father. The kind of fear that was on her face. I mean, I had never imagined a doctor, young doctor, would look like that. That was like the height of emancipation for a Kashmiri girl to become a doctor or a professor. And for her to shrivel like that was something that stayed with me for a long time. And that happened to everyone. It didn't mean whether you were a doctor, professor, engineer, whoever you were. You're a Kashmiri and you can be decimated to that little tiny, really scared thing. So that of your value of your life not being of any value, you could die any minute. It's just like it's that was an that was like a and now it's just MSF did that study a few years ago, and it showed 45% of Kashmiri population are under mental distress.
Right.
So I'm just
I'm
wondering.
not surprised.
Yeah, I'm actually thinking if that's actually the number, because everyone in my family, extended family, will have one Dexid, that's like the anti-anxiety in their whatever tablet pouch, or that they go to. I don't really know anyone who doesn't.
And yet there is some joy in the book. I want people to understand that,
Sure.
that there are moments of joy when you are dancing in the storeroom to Nazia Hassan, or you're watching movies,
Yeah,
and, on the VCR, or listening to music on the radio. There are moments of joy.
yeah.
Talk about that as well, and how much of that also kept you sane.
Music, I think even now, I think that also comes back from the same girl who just so, because TV has become, TV's sort of became completely obsolete. We wouldn't be allowed to watch because TVs emit a kind of light, and any kind of light at during some evenings meant trouble.
Right.
TVs were off most of the 90s. Radios became the only go-to thing. So I literally remember every old, Hindi film song by heart. And Nazia Hassan, because she was my sister's, like she used to listen to Sajad Ali and Hassan Jahangir and Nazia Hassan. I used to really like her. And at some point, I was like, oh, I want to grow up like her. So there was this there was fear, there was anxiety, but there was also a girl
Yeah.
who was still alive
Right.
inside me, who also wanted to do normal things that a young girl wants to do
Yeah.
at the age of 14 or 15. And the thing is, I remember vividly is I used to spend a lot of time looking, just staring at uh, the second last page of an Indian daily, which would talk about films, which would talk about, and I would imagine them. I would imagine the kind of shows that they would be. I would imagine. So I think a lot, I started relying a lot on imagination. So I would just go and find these corners, but I would also enact that
Enact.
out, in my own way. And it would just like hold me for a day, for 2 days. So it was like literally like balance. And also to feel attracted to boys is
Yeah.
something, again, a very fundamental basic thing of adolescence, right? So if that also happened, and again, by looking at newspapers, magazines, you could again imagine that there was a life that was possible uh, within what the new reality also was. So
And you talk of this epistolary relationship that you had with this boy who went to Bangalore to study engineering. I wonder what happened to that relationship.
since he was a distant cousin, we sort of I mean, he's still in touch, but then he got married to someone else and he has a family. But the way it broke was just eventually it was funny because the post office burned down and we couldn't write
Yeah,
to each
I mean, it's almost comical,
It is, and
but it's so sad.
yeah, and then so I think that's why there is no bitterness between him and I. We couldn't really blame anyone.
Yeah.
And I remember once he'd come down to visit his parents.
And he
And
couldn't see you because of
there was
curfew.
curfew.
I mean, I can't imagine that. Imagine coming all the way down there or up there and then not being able to see you.
And then he left within, I think he was there initially supposed to be there for 2 weeks, and then he left in 4 days. So yeah, that was also cut short, and there was that frustration of, and also because you would read things, and then I would make like I would like to send him gifts, so I would just make like a small bouquet and bribe someone, can you just take it? So those things also happen, and they just sound very funny, but also survival of a different kind. Like you don't want to, you still have hope, and you don't want to let go of love.
Exactly. No. So, Farah, tell me a little, if you can, about your life now. Are you back in Kashmir? Do you see Kashmir differently now? You spent some time abroad, I know. Could you talk a little about that?
I I mean, because of the pandemic, I sort of haven't been able to go back home as frequently. But I'm in Delhi right now. I work as a freelance communication consultant, and I go. I mean, that's home. I mean, I was in Singapore, and I was also a PR, and I didn't want a citizenship because I just didn't want to leave home for some reason. I mean, not for some reason, for the reason that I still, the relationship really hasn't changed. I get asked this a lot. So they're like, what is your relationship with Kashmir now? I'm like, and how is Kashmir a part of your story, for example? I'm like, I'm a part of Kashmir's story.
Mhm.
It's just, it's not the other way around. So it's any relationship that you have with your home. So as ordinary, as simple, also because it's not what a home should be like and how your people should suffer. That's a completely different thing to it. But it's, people move out of their hometown. Sometimes they go out to study, sometimes they go out to work, but deep down you know where your heart lies. I think
Is your family there, most of it?
everyone, I
That,
think my sister and the youngest one and I are the only ones who are out. Every single one is there.
right.
We didn't really.
So, Farah, when you look at this book, when you read, do you reread it sometimes? And do you think of that little girl in Srinagar who was sort of just didn't know what was happening to her? And do you mourn her loss, or do you celebrate that she's come so far?
I actually, I did read a few chapters when it came out, and it's somehow not because of anything, but I really feel that I, as a 16, 15-year old, there was a lot. I mean, even though there was so much fear and chaos all around, there was proper war. There was also a lot of poise in that young girl. I don't know where did she draw that from, if she really relied on those silences, but there was also a lot of courage, a lot of poise. So I do dip into that and really draw a lot of inspiration from her to sort of, I think that younger self faced life in a far more dignified way than, honestly, now sometimes when life throws things the way it throws at everyone, but I think that young girl really had it in her to sort of take it and then not lose the hope, not lose the courage, not lose herself.
What has it taught you about solitude, about living alone, or being alone?
I think it happens to everyone in Kashmir, even though you're with people. There's a certain. That's why my hypothesis is the way we sort of connect to huzn and melancholia is also because we have been trained
Yeah.
to sort of just really rely on ourselves so much that at the end of the day, uh, you're your only support, really, and it's a and then, I mean, there's a sense of community, there's a sense of dependence, but there's also the sense of self-reliance, which it's not something heroic that we see as. I feel it's a very quiet quality, and but it's sort of helpful, because at the end of the day, you're by yourself anyway.
Did you have any experience of that during the lockdown where you had to be on your own?
I am on my own. I live by myself.
Right. So during the lockdown, how did that affect you? Because you'd already seen this kind of enforced exile in a way, and you talked about that beautifully when you said for you to be home is not necessarily to be safe. But when you had to undergo this sort of second lockdown in a way in your life. How did your experience sort of, change, or how did your experience in the past affect this?
I know I'm aware when I say I'm aware that I'm privileged when I say, I have a job and I had, I could work from home. And I also spend a lot of time reading and writing because in the last many years, the reading that I had done, I mean, I knew I wanted to write. I had been struggling to write for the last 10 years, literally, like 7 years actively. And then I really shifted my reading. I started reading African American authors, and I sort of really used the time last year, which like the commute time went down, extra meetings went down. So I really used that again to read and write more. And this was almost like a you you knew, like we talked about, staying home was staying safe. There was this anxiety of parents being alone at home, but there is another sister who is there, so there was also not that crippling anxiety. So been I think this has been a bit of a time that I had finally, it's a time which has taught me, which, when back home, when there used to be lockdown and curfew, it was always a sense of that you're not safe.
Mm.
But it's almost like something happens to that young girl and she feels that you can be by yourself and you can
Yeah,
trust yourself. You can trust
that-
yourself again. So, which was not something that existed in that young girl earlier, but maybe this lockdown sort of worked in a way on her psyche. But
yeah.
rest is like how we all are suffering the ways
But
collectively.
in a way, it also liberates you, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, in a way, yes. Like when we talk about it, it was about finally relying on yourself and being responsible for yourself and taking care of yourself. To be honest, in some ways, that 9, 10, 11-year old just doesn't leave you, in a lot of ways. She's still there. And it's like a constant struggle to sort of, if your formative years have been like that, so how do you make sure that you don't regress back and you keep moving on?
Right. Thank you so much, Farah Bashir, for teaching us so much about resilience, about courage, about really living through such a difficult time and still seeing hope in the world. I think that's really quite an extraordinary thing. Um, Farah Bashir, A Girlhood in Kashmir, Rumours of Spring. Please
Thank
do read it.
Thank you so much for your time, Kaveri. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Thank
Thanks. Bye bye.